Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we're gonna be looking at a dialog system that I put together. Before we go into looking into how it's set up, I just want to show you how it looks as a finished product. So here we are with the merchant. We have him rigged up to be able to interact with the pull of the controller trigger. So let's set that up. Pull the trigger here, and the merchant stands up, and here we have a nice dialog coming up. For now this UI is kind of temporary, but it shows pretty much what we're trying to get to here. So we have the initial dialog. Says, hi, my name is Joel here. Say, okay, continue. It's good to see you. Thank you. And I say, want to sell something? Say, hey, yes. This pulls up the sell UI. Okay, we're done with the sale. Go back. Then if we interact again, it goes back to, oh, it's good to see you. Great. Want to sell something? No. Goes back to sitting. Try that again. Yes. So that part's working. The main things to notice here is that we have an initial dialog that shows up the first time that we are interacting with the NPC. And then we have a piece of recurring dialog that shows up every time we interact with the merchant when we're trying to sell something. So let's see how that's set up. First, let's look at our game object here. We have the merchant. And the merchant used to have this interactable script to pull up the sell items UI. But now instead of pulling that up, it's pulling out the dialog handler, which is a new component that we've added here. And this dialog handler has a scriptable event here that is pulling up the sell items UI. We'll look a little bit more into why this is set up this way, but for now, this is how it's set up. We have the dialog UI itself that is set up much like all the other UIs, except that this one has this dialog UI script, which we'll look into in a minute, but this is basically what's handling the UI here. You can see here in the UI, if we get closer, that we have a bunch of buttons here, but we weren't seeing them when we were interacting with the merchant before. And that is because those options are actually handled here with a horizontal layout group. So whenever we deactivate some buttons, the layout group handles the position and the size of the buttons. So it automatically expands to take up the available space, which is just really nice. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward UI here. But yeah, let's look at the code. This is a bit of a complex component system, so we're gonna go one by one, and hopefully by the end it will all make sense. First, we have a new class that's called the Dialog Option. This is basically just a string for the button text and a Unity event that will get triggered. This is how we are scripting the button options that we have in the dialog box. We can decide what text to show, for example the yes or no that we saw before, and then what actions will pushing those buttons actually trigger, which are these Unity events here. Then we have a dialog unit. This is one unit of dialogue, which can be a number of sentences, but it encapsulates a conversation, so to speak. This dialog unit has a few things. First, it has a required state key. We'll see that in a minute, but this is how we're keeping track of where in the dialog tree the player is currently at. If you remember in the beginning when we first interacted with the merchant, we had an initial welcome message, but then the other times we interacted with him, that message didn't come up again. And that's because we advanced the player dialog state to move past that first initial welcome message. But we'll see how that's set up in a bit. After the required state key, we have an array of strings here that will be the sentences to display in the text box. And then we have an array of these dialog options. These are the button setups that we had before. So if you remember, these are the button text that we have here and the Unity events to trigger when we click on those buttons. So that encompasses what I'm calling here a dialog unit. Then, as I mentioned, the player has a dialog state that controls where in the dialog tree we should be looking for the next piece of dialogue. This is basically a dictionary of strings, and what we have here is a mapping of the NPC that we are interacting with to which state we are currently with that NPC. This way we can handle state for multiple NPCs. Where, for example, in the middle of a quest, there may be an NPC that currently has a piece of dialogue that we care about, but we also want to know that we've already gone through the welcome message with the merchant. So we want to keep track of all the NPCs and where we are in their dialogue trees. And for now, this is being reset on start, but in the future we'll want to actually save the current dialogue state and load it anytime we restart a playthrough, so that the player doesn't need to go through the whole dialogue tree all over again every time we restart. On top of that, we also have a scriptable event, very similar to the dialog option. This is also a string with a Unity event, but the purpose of this scriptable event is quite different. This is what we're using here with the merchant to be able to trigger specific events in the conversation. For example, being able to open the sell items UI whenever the user clicks on yes when the merchant asks if they want to sell something. So very similar construction, but this is actually used as the internals of the dialog tree. And we'll see that in a second. The dialog tree, as it's set up here, is a scriptable object that we're going to be using later in the dialog handler. And it has a number of things. First, as you saw, it has the name of the NPC. Remember, the merchant is now called Joel. It has a default state. This is whenever we first interact, or when we interact with an NPC for the first time, we want to set up that default state so that we don't start with an empty state. Then we have a default dialog option that will be used later. And then we have an array of strings that are the scriptable callback names. We'll also look into that in a bit. And then we have the dialog units, which are the actual pieces of dialog that we'll go through. And we can see here in the merchant dialog tree object that we have this set up, right? So we have the name of the NPC as Joel, we have the default state. This can be anything, but for now I'm using single letters as a way of defining the dialog tree, and you'll see later on how this can be very powerful to create different branches in the dialog and be able to move forward and backwards in the dialog tree. We'll look into that in a later video because it can be quite complex, but for now, just know that every state in the dialog tree basically consists of a letter, and a chain of letters becomes the path in the dialog tree. We have here the default option that you saw before, which is just a continue option. We have a number of scriptable callbacks here. For now, we only have the OpenCell UI callback, but this is what you saw before that was getting called from the merchant. And then we have the dialog units. For now, only two of them. First is the welcome message that you saw, which is at the default state of A here. And it just says, hi, welcome to the town. And then it has a default option of continue, so that whenever you click on the continue button, it adds a new state of A. So we move into AA, actually, which will be the next step here. And then we continue directly into the next step or into the next stage. That way the player doesn't need to interact with the merchant again just to trigger the next piece of dialogue. And this is the one that you saw repeat a number of times. So once we are in the AA state, as long as we don't change that state, we'll continue to see this dialogue whenever we interact with the merchant. So here in the second state has the sentences that you saw. It's good to see you and want to sell something. And then we have these dialog options. We have the option of saying yes, which triggers the OpenCell UI scriptable callback, which opens the sell items UI. And then we have the option of no, that just ends the dialogue, as you saw. Beyond what you saw there in the editor, we also have a number of other helper members here. We have the dialog state. As you saw before, this is what we're using to figure out where we are in the dialog tree with this particular NPC. Then we have a continue callback and an end dialog callback that we'll see in action in a second. This is using the action type, which is a basic delegate with no parameters. Then we have this dictionary that is holding our dialog units. We use this because we cannot serialize dictionaries in the editor. We actually have the dialog units as a regular dialog unit array. And then at runtime, we are building this dictionary that will match the required state as a string into a specific dialog unit. And we can use that to look up the next dialog unit based on the current state. And then we also have this dictionary of scriptable callbacks that, as you saw, takes a string key and it has an action delegate to call. We'll see that in a bit. We have a number of helper methods here. We're using these methods to handle the state. We can add to the state, as you saw, if we had the state was A and we move to AA, which is the second step in the dialog tree. We have that. If we had a second option, could be AB, or we could go into a third layer, which would be AAA and AAB, but that's how that's handled. And then we also have remove state if we want to, let's say for whatever reason, go back a step into the dialog tree. If we had a multi-step conversation, we could use remove state to go back a number of steps in the dialog tree. And that's why we are using this chained state, so we can go forward and backwards. And then we have this reset state method that just completely gets a whole new key, so we can jump from one place in the dialog tree to another. For example, we have a quest that completely bypasses a conversation. We could use reset state to skip that. Then we have this method for calling the scriptable actions, we get the key for the action name here, and then that gets called here. For example, as you saw for the OpenCell UI, this is what we're using here. You just pass the OpenCell UI key here, and that calls the attached scriptable action here. We have a couple of methods for continue and end dialog that just trigger these callbacks. We'll see how this get hooked into the UI itself, and it impacts how the UI is displayed. Then we have a few setup methods here. We have the register scriptable callback method that we're using here to go from the scriptable callbacks array into the actual dictionary for scriptable callbacks. We have the setup Dialog Units dictionary, which similarly goes from the Dialog Units array into setting up an actual dictionary, so we can look up the Dialog Units based on the required state key. We have a setup Dialog State here that we're using. If you remember, the dialog tree itself has an internal dialog state. This is not the main dialog state. We have a dialog state that's living actually in the player. We can see that here, that the player has a dialog state. It actually lives here in the interactor, and you'll see in a bit why we're having it in the interactor. But just so you know, it's so that whenever we're interacting with the merchant, we can pass the dialog state to the merchant here. So with that dialog state being passed from the player, we just set it up here so that every time that we interact with an NPC, we have the latest dialog state. This can be useful, for example, if you have multiple NPCs affecting the dialog state. For example, if you finish a quest or you finish a particular conversation, that may move your state forward with a different NPC. That's why we have the state living with the player and not with every specific NPC. We have another helper method here to reset the callbacks. When we're using the scriptable actions, it's good to be able to clear out previous callbacks so that they don't get stuck in the scriptable object, because since the scriptable object keeps the callbacks between play sessions, it's possible that you have old references to a previous play session. So that's why we have this helper method here. And then finally, a very important one, we have a method to get the next dialog unit. This is where we actually look up the current state, and if we have a dialog unit that matches that state, we pass that back. Cool, so now let's look at the dialog handler. This is living here in the merchant, and is the one that is controlling how the dialog is connected to the different game objects in the scene. You can see here we have a reference to the dialog tree that we saw before. We have a reference to the dialog UI. We have a specific callback for when the dialog ends. And then we have a number of scriptable events that you saw before, which we'll be able to call from directly from the dialog tree. So when we're setting everything up, we first start by resetting all the callbacks. So if we had any stale reference there, they all get cleared out. Then for every scriptable event that we have set up in the dialog handler, we register them as callbacks, as you saw before. So we have this OpenCell UI scriptable event that we want to later call here in the merchant dialog tree. We actually have to register it. So we register it in the beginning. Then we go through the other setup events, like setting up the Dialog Units dictionary, and then we attach a few callbacks here for continuing the dialog and ending the dialog. This is both for the dialog UI and for the dialog handler here. Then we have this very important one, which is the onInteract method. This is where we are passing the dialog state coming from the player into the dialog tree. And because onInteract, in general, we cannot pass the dialog state directly, but we can only pass the interactor. We're using the interactor here to get the dialog state, and that's why the dialog state is currently living with the interactor. If at a later time it makes more sense to have it live elsewhere, then we'll look into that. But for now, just when the player first interacts with the merchant, we pass the current dialog state from the player into the dialog tree, and then call the continue dialog, which will pull the next dialog unit available given the current state. And the continue dialog method simply calls handle dialog on the next dialog unit. We can see here for the handle dialog, we are modifying the dialog UI. We give it the NPC name. For the NPC that we're interacting with, we pass the sentences in the dialog unit. We also pass the dialog options. We have all the dialog options that we have in the current dialog unit and also the default option coming from the dialog tree. And we also call continue dialogue on the Dialog UI. And then finally we have the endDialog method that simply calls the onDialogEnd Unity event that we have. Now for the Dialog UI, we have a few things. We have references to the NPC text and the sentence text. This is where we'll be populating the different strings that come from the dialog handler. And then we have a few private methods here. We have an array of buttons that you saw before. We have a queue where we're storing all the sentences. We'll go through this queue one by one. That's why we can have multiple messages in a single dialog unit. We have an array of dialog options that you saw from before. This will be applied to the different buttons. And then we have a default dialog option also that we can use here. In the beginning, we just get the reference to the buttons that are in the UI. We initialize the sentences queue and we turn the game object off by default, so it's not always showing. Then we have the setup methods here. We are setting up the NPC name, as you saw from before. We're also getting the sentences in the current dialog unit. We're adding this to the queue instead of displaying them directly. And then we have the dialog options. We're also capturing this in these private variables. Then we have the meat of the dialog UI here. Whenever we're calling continue dialog, we make sure that the dialog UI is visible by setting it to true, active true. Then we are trying to display a sentence. If we are successful in displaying that, if we have a sentence to display, then we also display a continue button so that we are able to move on to the next sentence. If we are at the last sentence or we don't have any more sentences to show, then we show the dialog options if we have any, or if we don't have any, we try to display the default dialog options. And if for whatever reason we don't have either, then we simply end the dialog, which as you see here is simply setting the UI to active false so that it's hidden. As you saw before, when we're trying to display a new sentence, we first check that we have sentences to display. If not, we return false. Then we get the next sentence from the queue here. And then if after getting that sentence, we know that there's no further sentences, we also return false. Otherwise, we return true. This way, not only when we have no sentences left, but also when we're in the last sentence, we will try to display the dialog options. This feels a little bit hacky, but it prevents the situation where you have to click continue just to get to the dialog options. Before, as you saw, when the merchant says, do you want to buy something? Since that's the last sentence in that unit, we want to immediately show the yes or no options. We don't want to have the user have to click continue just to see that the options are yes and no. So that's why we're skipping one sentence ahead in this case. And then we have the display buttons methods. These are all very similar, and next time around I'm hoping to have this refactor into less repetitive code, but they all go through the same loop. First, if we have no buttons, we return. This shouldn't be ever an issue, but if that's the case, we want to prevent having an error here. Then we're looping through all the buttons. And for the couple of methods, the continue dialog option and the display default dialog option, here we only want to target the first button. So that's why we're singling the first button out. And then we're setting up that button to, well, first we get the text object there, and then we set the text to either continue or whatever the default is here. Then we make sure to remove all on-click listeners, because since we are reusing these buttons, it may be the case where we already have a previous listener here that we want to clear out. Then we add the listener here. For the continue button, it's just continue dialog. For the default option, we'll get that from the default dialog option in the action to trigger. And then we set that particular button to be active. And then all the others, we simply set to false. For the case where we have more than one dialog option, we do a very similar loop, except that we are going through all the options in this loop, and for every option that we have available, we are setting the text and the action to trigger that comes from the dialog option. And if we run out of options before we run out of buttons, we set the other buttons to false. As you saw, for example, even though we have 5 buttons, in the yes/no question, we only have 2 options, right? Yes or no. So we set those here, and the other 3 buttons are just set to false. And that's all. It's quite a bit. It's quite a complex system. It takes quite a while just to go through it, just to explain it. But it's a very powerful system that can be used for very complex dialogue and conversations here. it also has the added benefit that it can tie actions from the dialog option. As you saw before, you're able to pull up a different UI from an action button, and that's completely scriptable here in the editor without having to go around and adding code. As long as you have some of these objects set up already, you can call them out directly through these scriptable actions. As you saw here, for example, for the OpenCell UI, this is simply something that we add here in the editor, and we don't have to add any more code because we already had the UI here and we already have a method to turning on and off. There are a few considerations here. One of the biggest pain points right now for this is that you always have to be mindful of the dialog state. And because you are hooking up the dialog to different UI, for example here in the cell UI, the close button actually needs to be aware that it comes from a dialog and it needs to call the end dialog action here. That is something that I'm still not very happy about, but it's one way to make sure that all things are tied together. Because if you're calling actions from the dialog, you need to make sure that those actions are aware that they're coming from a dialog and you're able to shut them down later. So it is possible that we could set this up programmatically directly from the options, but it gets a bit more complicated. So for now, we're letting a little bit of this scope creep happen here. But otherwise, the system is very powerful, and I think it'll be very useful for setting up a number of things here in the game. Now that we're aware of how it's built, let's just look once again at it so that you can see all the pieces in action. Okay, so here we are with the merchant again. You can see when we interact with the merchant, he has this initial dialog here. It says, hi, welcome to the town. And then I have this continue button. This continue button triggers the next dialog unit, which is, hey, it's good to see you. This is the first sentence. Want to sell something? Second sentence. And because that's the last sentence, we get the dialog options. Yes or no. So we go yes. We're calling the scriptable action here, which opens the sell items UI, which we can it actually works. It's all hooked up, so we can sell some items here. It's all nice. And then when we close, it calls the dialog end, which finishes the interaction with the merchant. We can trigger the interaction again, and we're back to the second state in the dialog tree, which is, as the first sentence is good to see you, and then the second sentence want to sell something. Now here we get the options again, yes or no. And that's how it's all set up. It's a very, very powerful system that I'm hoping to use a lot of for all the story and all the dialogue that will happen in the game. In any case, I know this has been a super long video. I hope that you found it useful and that you were able to understand how the pieces are set up together. I definitely recommend going back and checking out all the pieces again. It took me quite a bit to put it together, and it needed to be drawn out on paper and just thinking through all the different steps. So I wouldn't blame you if it's not easy to understand the first time around. But definitely check it out. Try to see how it's built and see if it's useful to you. Definitely if you have suggestions on how to improve it. It's a very complex system, so I'm definitely open to hearing your opinion on how it can be improved and made simpler to use while keeping most of the power that it has. Because it's definitely useful to do a number of things through dialog here with scriptable actions. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that was useful for you to see all of this, and I'll see you in the next one when we're looking more into the questing system that we'll be using this dialog system here. But that's it for today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.